This chapter will be spent addressing concerns that lead us to the American Revolution. So, as we examine concepts throughout this chapter, think how does this connect to the start of the American Revolution? Okay, so the colonies in the 1700s, late 1600s, early 1700s become more economically independent, and they become a significant part of the entire English empire, the British Empire's monetary system. So, in order to understand that better, we're going to talk about this concept called mercantilism. Make sure you understand what mercantilism is. Mercantilism is where countries seek a favorable balance in trade. Okay, that means they want to export more than they import. European countries are competing, England, France, Spain, Portugal. These countries are competing to be self-sufficient. They want to have other nations depend on their exports. They do not want to be dependent on other people's exports. This idea, again, is called mercantilism, a desire for a favorable balance in trade. At the basis of this system is gold, a desire for gold. It is the gold and also silver. It's the currency that is used in the world at this time. Okay, so claiming lands throughout the world and laying claim to the resources of those lands is going to be beneficial for these European countries. So mercantilism is kind of the driving force. Okay, so now we get to the late 1600s, early 1700s, and Britain has these colonies along the Atlantic seaboard in the Americas. Well, it is beneficial for England to maintain the exports of the colonies inside of their system. If these colonies engage independently in trade with other countries, that empowers the colonies outside of the British mercantilism system. So, Parliament, that's the legislative body in England, they pass a series of laws that are called the Navigation Acts. And it ensures that the colonies only exist to provide Britain with, or England to be more specific and more correct, only exist to provide England with raw materials. So what that means is anything that's leaving those 13 colonies, that is those are England's 13 colonies. Anything leaving their ports has to enter another English port. So the colonies don't have the freedom by this law to trade with whatever nation they want to. They are British colonies, they're an English colony, and they must supply the mother country only with raw materials. Okay, so the other part of that is purchasing goods. Okay, so the colonies provide raw materials. You don't have manufacturing overwhelmingly here in the colonies. They're just supplying raw materials, unfinished materials like timber, tar, tobacco, indigo, rice. They're not refining these products and sending them directly to market. They're providing raw materials. So, in return, the colonies are a market that English manufacturers can turn around and sell their goods to. The Navigation Acts also make it illegal for the colonies to purchase any finished manufactured products from any other country outside of England. So if it leaves a colonial port, it has to enter another British port. If it enters colonial port, it must be coming from another English port. So the Navigation Acts kind of hammer down this idea that the colonies exist for the good of the mother country only. A lot of colonial merchants are resentful of the Navigation Acts. They feel like that it doesn't always benefit them, and it requires them to perhaps sell their raw material at a cheaper price to England than they might be able to get in another part of the world, and it forces them to sometimes pay a higher price for manufactured goods that are coming from England that they might get from other countries. And if possible, many merchants do smuggle. That means they trade illegally with other countries outside of the English system. Okay, so there's one large scale benefit to the Navigation Acts, and you want to write this down. Because of the emphasis placed on shipping from the colonies to England, especially in the northern region of New England, there is an immense development in the shipbuilding industry. So in New England, you see a intentional effort to build up the shipbuilding industry there in New England, and that is it's a positive. It's certainly a benefit that comes out of the Navigation Acts. Okay, so kind of changing our focus here, and we're going to look back across the Atlantic and look at England, what's happening in England. The 1600s is a century of religious upheaval in England. We're talking about the Protestant Reformation, and there's this swing back and forth between Catholic monarchs and Protestant monarchs. And throughout the 1600s, England is becoming more and more Protestant. Okay? So even with Protestant monarchs, many of them aren't that religious and don't want to see much change in the Anglican Church. Remember that the Puritans of New England are seen by many as really rigid, religious people, and this will their practices will upset some of the monarchs. And so because of smuggling and some religious persecution, some reasons that just boil down to religious persecution, in 1684, King Charles revokes the corporate or business charters in Massachusetts, and he will create a royal charter which gives the monarch more control over the colony of Massachusetts. Okay, well then in 1685, King James, we see a change in monarchs here 1 year later. In 1685, King James, who is believed by many to be a Catholic, King James creates this Dominion of New England. What he does is he revokes all three of the New England colonies' charters. That's Rhode Island, Connecticut, and Massachusetts. He revokes all three of their charters and puts them under one charter that's just called New England. And then he appoints a governor, one of his guys, Sir Edmund Andros. And Andros is just simply appointed to terrorize and antagonize those Protestants. Remember that James is Catholic. And so there you have for a space of time, the people of New England are under the strong hand of a governor who is persecuting them, and he's using economic sanctions to do that. Okay, and then something interesting occurs. 4 years later, 1689, Parliament does something revolutionary. Okay, so you want to get this. Parliament is a representative body. It's the people in Parliament are elected by their regions throughout England. Okay, so this is a representative lawmaking body that's supposed to be a mirror of the people. Okay, and Parliament asks King James, who is a Catholic, they ask him to step down, and they invite his daughter Mary and her husband William and Mary of Orange, asked them to come and rule England. And this is called the Glorious Revolution because it's a bloodless revolution. King James steps down, and William and Mary of Orange come into England without a fight, and they sit on the throne of England. Okay, so Parliament, here's one of the big takeaways here. Parliament, which is a reflection of the people. Parliament asserts its authority and power over the monarch. They pretty much tell the monarch what to do, and the monarch steps down, and Parliament invites a new monarch to sit on the throne. So this is a glorious revolution. It represents the power of the people over the monarch. Now, influential here are the ideas of John Locke. Write this down. John Locke writes a series of treatises on government, and in this treatise on government, he explains the nature of government, what government is supposed to do. So he explains that governments are put in place to keep the people safe, to protect their property. People join into government, or they allow government to rule over them to protect their property. He says to protect their life, liberty, and property. But when governments become abusive, it's the right of the people to alter or abolish those governments. And you should recognize that language as the language of what will become the Declaration of Independence. But that's John Locke's second treatise on government, which you'll read at some point. Okay, so Sir Edmund Andros, pictured here, is the governor of Massachusetts, but when King James is exiled, he tries to flee the New England area dressing like a woman and tries to escape. And he does barely escapes his with his life. So one of the drawbacks that we see in the Glorious Revolution is because James was a Catholic, and Catholics were becoming increasingly a minority in England. We see that after the Glorious Revolution, one of the effects is the persecution of Catholics. Okay, we're looking within the world context. This is the Protestant Reformation, and Protestants are growing in England. Protestantism is growing in England, and with the Glorious Revolution, you see some persecution of Catholics as a result or as a consequence. Okay, so under this period of William and Mary of Orange's reign in England, they are dealing with a lot of internal issues in England. Religious unrest. They're also dealing with a parliament that is asserting its control over the monarch, and so they ultimately ignore the colonies for 50 years. The colonies are doing what, under the mercantilism system, they were intended to do. They are supplying England with raw materials, and the colonies exist as an economic benefit to England. And so William and Mary of Orange, the monarch, ultimately ignores them. For this 50-year period that we call salutary neglect, it allows the seeds of self-government to take root in the colonies. All of these colonies, each one separately and independently, has its own legislature, and the legislatures are representative, meaning that the people elect those representatives to make laws for their colony, and they're making laws to do all sorts of things. They are making laws to set wages. They make laws to establish taxes. So they're functioning legislatures, and they are regulating their own affairs. Now, the control that the